Okay, so for this project, I wanted to model some like set pieces for maybe like a little scene that you're gonna make, like in Unreal or something. And not only did I want to have like just some cool little assets here that you would see maybe on the interior of an old building or something, but I also wanted to take these into Houdini and just kind of damage them, destroy them, weather them down a little bit, get some pieces of them like they've kind of fallen apart, and really have this neat like kit bash asset package thing that you could really set dress and create a really cool looking scene. So I just quickly modeled these up in Maya. I have kind of like a trim thing that would maybe go around like the top ceiling of a building or something on the inside. These columns that you could scatter in there. This I've just called like a doorway topper, a door topper. So you can imagine this is like the top of the door and people walk under it here. And then this is just like a regular topper that maybe this is like in the corners of the rooms or something and the columns are holding it up, something like that. But I wanted to be able to just make like a bunch of really cool damaged and broken assets out of these starter assets. So we're going to jump into Houdini. Okay, so now we're in Houdini here. And I have just a few nodes here on the object level. The first one that I'll show is I have this thing just called starting geo. I did this just so I could put multiple pieces of geometry in here. So we'll start with the door topper. That'll be kind of my example here. I brought it in. I noticed its transforms were a little bit off, so I just transformed it so it was more kind of where it needed to be. And you can see the wireframe on it. It's just that original from Maya. I have this object merge here, and what that's doing is it's actually taking what I have in my break planes here. So if I turn this one off and turn my break planes on, you can see I have these weird, wacky planes here, right? And if we go into here, you can see I just start with a grid. You can just see that grid. It's just normal, nothing too crazy. Make it a little bit bigger. I went 40 by 40 on this. I added 100 rows, 100 columns, just so I could get some interior detail on this. I drop in a little mountain node and kind of mess with its settings here. I always use like sparse convolution or something like that. I adjusted the height, the element size, and that kind of gave me something like this. So I have this thing, it's called Hero Asset Breaker, and not that I'm breaking a hero asset, but I wanted it to be a more deliberate and like artistic approach to breaking and destroying some sort of asset. So that's why I called it Hero Asset, is so I can be more deliberate and really hand place where I want these breaks and cracks to go. So after I create one grid and I give it some noise with that mountain, I'm actually just passing it through a little transform node where I can just kind of rotate it and position it where I want. So the way I did that was I just kind of had my starting geo in place, came into here, and then I could kind of see where it was. And so I just did that with a few grids, kind of just transformed them, put them where I want. And then down here, I just merged them into one thing so that all three of them exist at the same time. And then I have this null here that I just called out. That way I can just kind of output it somewhere else. And where I'm outputting that is actually back in my starting geo, and I have this object merge where it's looking for that out. So if you drop in an object merge, it says, okay, what object do you want to bring into this and merge together? So you can just click on this little thing and go select it. So I looked in my breaking planes node there, and I found my output null that I named out. And you can see that it just brought in the three planes. And then I have a Boolean Fracture. So what the Boolean Fracture does, let's pull one in here. Let's see, Boolean Fracture. So it has two of these pins up here. The red arrows on them mean that they're required. So I have to have something going into this one and this one. So if I just kind of mouse over what it is, it tells me required, geometry to fracture. So the geometry I want to fracture is this door topper that I've transformed up a little ways. So that's why that line goes into that first pin right there on the Boolean Fracture. That's the geometry to fracture. The next one is the cutting surface. So this is the stuff that's actually going to be cutting through our geometry. And obviously the things that are going to be cutting through are my cutting planes that I outputted here in my object merge. So that's why that wire is connected into that pin. Okay. So now let's get rid of our flag on that one so we can only see this node now. So if I jump down to my Boolean Fracture, you can see it doesn't really look all that different, right? So let's go back up to my transform. I'll turn my wireframe on so you can kind of see the regular wireframe. Now if I click on the Boolean again, you can see, okay, there's a few cuts here. So I have a cut there, and I'm taking a little chunk out here at the top, right? And then if you want to see what it's looking like, I usually just drop in an exploded view and kind of just set these things apart. So that looks pretty cool. So I'm kind of imagining, you know, maybe this thing sits on top of a doorway, and obviously it's not connected at the back. It's just kind of sitting there, big stone that's been chiseled and shaped into this doorway topper here. And maybe over time it came apart and fell off, and you know, it's pretty heavy, made of a really sturdy, hard, maybe cement material or granite or something. And maybe it hit the ground and it just kind of fell into a few pieces here, and then maybe over time this kind of got weathered away here. So that's why it's just, you know, a couple deliberate slices here that are giving me some cool chunks. If we look at the interior here, if I go to my smooth shaded, you can see that the normals are still hard on that. So if I go back to this Boolean, I can actually change the interior cusp angle here, and that'll do it on all the interior faces. So you can see as I bring that back, the normals are hardened, and if I drag it out, it starts to soften it. And then that looks pretty cool. Okay. So after my exploded view, basically what I wanted to do after this was I'm going to keep it exploded, because again, I just wanted to get different assets out of the original asset. So what I do next is I drop in a little group node, and this is going to be what plugs into my piece grabber here. So I have this group, and I've just selected all the faces on this piece down here. Okay, and then I feed it into a delete node, and I say, okay, delete group number 1, but then I tell it delete non-selected. So it's actually deleting the opposite. So even though I have this piece selected, it's going to delete everything else. So if I highlight that, now you can see I have just that piece, and that is what's going to go into my piece grabber. And then I want to output this in some way. So I have my game reser. Let's turn this off, and let's maybe turn that one on. And you can see I have this kind of broken up in here just so I can do it all step by step here. So if I have my object merge, which again, I just drop that in, tell it, you know, hey, use my piece grabber null node right there. Piece grabber. Okay, I transform it so that it's closer to the origin, just so it's all nice when I place it in, let's say, like Unreal or something. Okay, I'm going through a remesh node, so that's why this is separated first, because sometimes remeshing it can take a while if you have lots of detail, but this shouldn't take too long, so I just put it through a remesher, and if we look at the wire shaded now, you can see, you know, it's quite dense, there's a lot of detail. Obviously, this is not game ready, right? Then I have a fuse, and sometimes when you use that remesh, it might create a few holes and some mismatches. So I'm just using a fuse, and I've just dialed in the snap distance here on this example. So hopefully it cleans up any holes that might arise. And then sometimes you need to put it through a cleanup anyways, and there's just a few options in there to help fix any other weird stuff that goes on. So that's basically giving me just a really high-res mesh that has all that detail. But then finally we come to this game res node. All right, so after we've done that cleanup, I have this mesh. It's really quite dense, so we got to get it game ready, right? So the game dev toolkit has a game res SOP node, and this thing's pretty neat. It has a few options here. So we have, not only do we have a reduce tab here, and I've just set it down to 2000, for example, here. And then it has some options on how long each segment is and everything. It also has the ability to do an auto UV for you, and I'm just going to keep it on UV auto seam. You can always check that and do shortest path, cluster, UV unwrap. UV auto seam, I think, will be fine enough for our example. There are some options to tweak. And finally here, we have some baking options. So I'm just going to leave it at a 2048 by 2048 texture. I don't have any color on here, so I'm not going to do a vertex color map here. But I do want a normal map for all this detail, as well as an ambient occlusion for some of the shadowing that I'm getting. And then I'm just going to leave it, so I am in my hero asset breaker project here, so I'm just going to leave it as my hip, and it's going to put it in my render folder, and it's just going to make it the hip name, and whatever channel it's doing, normal or AO, and it's already filling in a target for me, so that's sweet. And then the reason I always just keep it separate down here until I'm done with everything before it is just because as soon as you connect it and have it be the display, it's going to start doing it, and you just don't want to have that connected and have the display on before you're ready, basically, because then it'll just start trying to bake something, and it'll fill up your project with a bunch of unnecessary files that you don't need. So I'm going to drag that in and go ahead and hit the display flag, and you'll see it'll start rendering. Hopefully it shouldn't take too long here. Okay, so now that it's done that, you can see it's actually reduced it here. And if I go to like smooth shaded, you can see it's giving me a fairly decent output here. There's a little bit of issues with the AO and stuff, but again, this is a damaged asset, and this is just an example for now, so I think it's okay. But basically what it does is if I go into my documents now, Houdini projects, and go to my render, you can see I already have all my pieces already done. I tweaked some of the settings and stuff to really make them look good, but you can see that it actually gave me, this is the one I just did, it gave me the AO and the normal, so I could just rename those if I want. And then the last thing I want to do to save the geometry, what I like to do is just, again, right click on it, say save, save geometry. We can go pick our path here. I'll just put it in the render here so we can see it. And we'll just do example.fbx, I guess. That'll work. Accept. And accept. And then again, if I look at that, now we have our FBX. And that's that. All right. So I wanted to show a little bit different way of destroying some assets. And this one can get you some really cool stuff. This one is more random, it's more numbers based, and it can give you some really cool results and some different results if you just tweak a few numbers very quickly. So this one's less deliberate, less artistic, much more procedural, much more dynamic. So I'm just going to show a quick example here. I'm just on my object level. I'm going to drop in a sphere, and I'll double click on that. Right now it's a primitive type. I actually want it to be polygons. And let's just change the frequency to something a little bit higher, like 6. That's fine. So if you've ever been in Houdini and you're trying to like break things and explode them or whatever, you're probably familiar with a Voronoi fracture. And what that requires is some sort of geometry to fracture, which we have, and then also requires some points. So I'm just going to quickly drop in an ISO offset. It'll create kind of this foggy thing. I can then scatter some points within that. And let's not do 1,000. Let's just do like 10. Okay, and then that's my geometry. These are my points. So if I show that now, you can see that it's kind of cut through. You can see how the lines have some cuts in there. If I do a little exploded view to show that off, there you go. You can see it split it. But the problem with this that I don't really like for what I'm trying to accomplish is that the inside has no detail. It has no noise. The edges are totally clean. And I really wanted something that gave me some interior detail. So instead of taking, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 nodes to kind of get a break with not a lot of detail, why don't we use basically one node to do everything we want all in one go? So the node I'm going to use is called an RBD material fracture. I'll drop that in. It takes a little bit to load. And I'll just connect my sphere up to the required geometry. And you can see right here, it has something very similar to a Voronoi fracture. So it has 5 scatter points. I think I'm just going to leave it there for now. And it should have some, material presets. So concrete is what it has by default. But there's concrete, glass, wood. If you're on newer versions of Houdini, there's a custom one where you can really go in depth on the details here. But I'm just going to go with concrete for now because that's kind of what I want. It gives me the base starting stuff. So if I just kind of see what kind of break that's giving me here, and then drop in another exploded view. Okay, you can see it's giving me a bit more pieces and chunks and stuff, but it's still doing that same thing. It's basically a Voronoi fracture, right? So maybe just We'll step that down a little bit just so this can go a little bit quicker for this example here. Okay, so if I look here, there's the primary fracture. This is where it's just kind of doing that. It's just scattering points. It's got the volume, the fog volume, just like we were doing, but it's all within one node, which is super cool. But this detail tab right here has a couple of things we can turn on. It has an edge detail and an interior detail. So the first one I want to do, I definitely want to get some rocky, concrete looking interior detail. So let's go ahead and check that. And sure enough, I'm on a pretty decent computer streaming to my home computer here. So it went really fast. This sometimes can take quite a while, but it actually went fairly fast. So if we go to my smooth shaded, you can see that it did that. The other one we can do is the edge detail. So you can see how these, even though there's a lot of interior noise here, and we can of course change the amplitude, more or less noisy, right? So we'll just go with the default. We can always make the sizes a little bit bigger or whatever. And the frequency. You can also change if it's, this is basically like a mountain node if you're familiar with that. It starts with the sparse convolution, but you can also do like purlins and whirlies and all kinds of stuff. It's pretty neat. The edge detail here though, if you look, this edge is still very clean, right? So if I hit that edge detail one, this one might take a little bit longer too. But if I come in here now, you can see that it's actually kind of beat up the edges. They're now not quite as clean. We can always change the noise height on those. Oh, I may have gone a little too high here. We'll see how long it takes. All right, let's drop it back down a little ways. But there you go. You can see that it's really beating up the edges there, right? You can enable chipping. There's all kinds of stuff in here. But this is really what I wanted to get out of this, was a lot of interior noise. So then if you increase the scatter points, like let's maybe go with, let's see if we can push it. Let's do 10 and see what happens here. So there you're getting some cool stuff. Let's go ahead back into my detail. Let's turn off the edge detail, just so this speeds up a little bit. Go back to my primary fracture. Let's type in something like 30. Okay, and you can see, yeah, I'm still getting some of these pieces out here, but if I look on the inside here, I'm getting some cool rocky details. So let's go to my exploded view and let's really separate these so I can see this. So I'm getting some cool like rocks. Like this is a very simple rock generator that's going to give me some cool shapes. And I can always get those and I can output them pretty much the exact same way I did the other piece. I could just create a group. And select something. So let's maybe say I want to select, I don't know, might have to explode it a little bit more here. So I can isolate a piece here. So if I want to, let's say, output this piece. So that's my group. Actually, let's do one. That one's not on the, not all on the inside here. So let's make sure we do one that is definitely on the inside. So let's maybe do this one. So I'll select all of those, hit enter, do my delete. And if I tell it to delete group 1, it's going to delete that one. But then if I say delete non-selected, it's actually going to leave that one. So now I have this cool rock. I could give it some normals. See if I want it to be harder like it was, a little bit softer. Something like that. And then I can always use that game res node to output it, right? So that's kind of how I got just some random rocks, a little bit of a rock generator. There's multiple ways of doing a rock generator, but I thought doing that would be nice. The other reason to do this RBD thing is you can actually plug in whatever asset you want. So I just did this example as a sphere, but I'll go ahead and plug something in, and we'll be right back. All right, so I loaded in this other example here. This is just that topper piece that I had modeled. Now, because I modeled it kind of quickly and cheaply, this is all just like floating geometry here that I just kind of put in there. So the first thing I needed to do was put it through a little remesh, and then I ended up fusing it. And what that does is it actually makes it all one unified mesh. So then when I send it through this RBD material fracture, you can see it's starting to break apart some things. And then if I do that exploded view, we're getting some interesting shapes here. So now let's go ahead and take a look at what happens if we do some of that interior detail on this. Okay, so I finally got it to do some internal noise. It was taking a little while, so I decided to do a little cut there. And then I isolated a chunk that I thought looked pretty cool. And this is basically ready to do pretty much the same thing. Just go ahead and reduce it to that game reser and get something outputted. So you can see all that internal noise on there. Pretty cool. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to show as far as destruction was a little tool I built. I ended up calling it a Sandblaster, but really you could replace any of the shapes that we're using to maybe do like bullet holes or any other kind of weathering and damaging. So basically what I have is I have this thing that's called a Sandblaster. And if I go ahead and look at this, it's really just a grid. Like that's really all it is. Okay, but I can position this grid anywhere around some sort of asset that I have, and this can kind of act as like the wind direction. So if you're thinking of this as like a Sandblaster, think of like a column or a statue that's been out in the desert for decades or however long, and the wind has been hitting it from, particularly maybe one direction more than the others. That was kind of the goal with this. So I just put it here. It's just going to be blasting from this direction. Okay, if we jump back, I have a thing called whatever you want. For this example, all I've done is just plug in a cylinder. So I just have this tube, and what it's doing is it's taking this tube. I'm giving it an edge cusp just so that these top edges stay fairly creased and hard after I remesh it. So I'm remeshing it a little bit. I'm nulling the remeshed asset so I can actually go find that later. So I have it called remesh asset. Then I'm doing this thing with collisions. It's a collision source node. And that's just because when I actually throw the sand particles at it, I want to know where those are colliding with this surface. And to make that go a little bit faster, if I'm doing a more complicated mesh, I am file caching that, and then that is actually creating a VDB, which is just a volume. So if you look at the difference here, you can see that it's kind of this weird VDB mesh, volume mesh, instead of the polygonal mesh, right? Okay, so from there, I'm also creating an attribute. I'm just naming it DOP path because it's going to go into an auto DOP network. It's going to pull in whatever you want into the auto DOP network. And it's just going to bring in all those collision sources. And then I just have this null VDB here just so I can find that later. Okay, so what does that all mean? So this Sandblaster is the source of where all those particles are going to come from. So I'm going to be throwing a bunch of particles at whatever asset I want. And then I'm going to, because I'm using actual particles, it has the source particles and an auto DOP network. So it's just going to be throwing particles across. And it does take a little while. I'm on my laptop here, so I won't have it go through the whole thing. But if we look at what it's doing, apparently it is going to go through the whole thing. Okay, that didn't take too long. So if we look at what it's doing, it's taking that DOP import record. So it's taking all of those impacts that we did from our Sandblaster particles. So we have our source particles. We're blasting them from our geometry here. We are getting the collision source and throwing that into our AutoDOP network. And then we're collecting the impacts here by importing our DOP records. And what we're looking for is our impacts. Okay? And then I'm throwing it through a solver. And then I'm using a time shift just to jump to the end of my timeline here. So I basically, from frame 1 to frame 240, I'm just throwing all these particles at it. And then I'm saying, hey, jump to the end. So it's jumping all the way to frame 240. And it's saying, hey, here's where all those particles hit on your cylinder or whatever asset I have plugged in. Okay, so it's getting those collections of where those particles are hitting. Then after that, I'm actually going down into what I call just the blast asset. So it's being blasted by that sand. Okay, so in my blast asset node here, I have a few nodes set up. One is just a file. I'm just bringing in a rock that I made in a rock generator. It's nothing too crazy. It's just some rocky noise and features on there. And then I'm transforming it because I need it to be a bit smaller. Okay, and then I'm bringing in my collect impacts using an object merge here. So if I show that, there's all that points from my Sandblaster. I am giving them normals just in case they're not pointing in the right directions or something. And then I am transforming them just so I can get them a little bit taller. You can see the difference here. If I have all of these in here, then it kind of does some weird stuff at the top of the cylinder with all these points. So I'm just kind of making it a little bit bigger here so I get a little bit better result. This also can be used to, if I make everything a little bit bigger, less of the rocks will be cutting through my cylinder, and if I make it smaller, more of them will cut through. So this gives me a little bit of control for how much damaging and how much weathering there is. And then really what I'm doing is I'm just copying all those rocks to the points like that. So there's quite a lot going on there. And there should be a copy stamp. So what's going on here is I've turned on transform cumulative. And then over in the stamp, because I have a transform here, I'm able to take a scale and a rotate and actually assign it a random value. So I'm doing random at any given point. And for the scale, I'm doing over 3.5. And for the rotate, I'm doing it by 360 degrees, right? And then in that transform, I actually just have the rotates using that stamp. So it says stamp from copy 1, which is this, right? That it's going to take rotate, and it's just going to start at 1. It's going to have a base rotation of 1. And that's going to give me some random rotations in the X, Y, and Z. Same thing with the scale. I'm doing that same thing. I'm getting the stamp, my copy 1, and I'm looking for the variable scale, and I'm doing a 0.2 as a default value. So even if it doesn't do anything, it will at least scale it to 0.2. And if you look in here, you can see that some of these are different sizes and different rotations and stuff. So that's giving me some different features and things. Okay, and now the next part, and this might take a little bit. I had to switch over to a more powerful computer here. So I'm remoting into my lab computer here. But I'm basically just taking all of those rocks and my object merge, and I'm sending them through a Boolean. Oh good, it didn't take long at all. And what that's doing is it's just kind of chipping away and putting some weathered and worn down features on this thing. And like I was saying, I could change this transform if I maybe made it a little bit wider. Like let's do 1.5. I'll have to let it sit here a little bit. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. Okay, so you can see what that ended up doing. I expanded it quite a bit. Normally it was 1.07 and everything. I did 1.5, and now you can see there's really hardly any detail in there. But you can see that there's a little bit. So just by tweaking these values, it gives me a different result. So that's pretty cool. Let's maybe try 1.1 and see if that gives me something just a little bit better. And there's a little bit different result from typing in 1.1. So kind of cool. And like I was saying, you can really plug in whatever asset you want to get something different going on in here. This was just a quick example using a cylinder. In my little kit bashing thing that I did on damaged assets, I ended up doing, it was basically a cylinder again, but it was a column, and I didn't have any of the details super deep like this. I actually kind of backed them off a little bit, but this one I just wanted to exaggerate it a bit just to kind of show it off. But yeah, once it's blasted and you have it done here, I have the weathered asset. And again, I would probably just output that. You can either do it in a different object level thing here using that game reser, or you could just do it here and find the game reser. Whoops, gamers, haha, game res. Get that game reser. Set it all up how you want. Maybe, there's quite a bit of detail in there. Maybe something like that. You can bake everything out. But this was just an example one, so I'm not going to bake that out. But I do have one done in my Unreal scene that you can see has a little bit of this, these holes and like perforation and stuff. So, okay. All right, now that I'm done with the Houdini end of everything, I've imported all of my pieces that I got from Houdini into Unreal. And you can look in here because of that, because I was using the game res thing, I have an asset, and then I have my ambient occlusion and my normal map on on all of these. And I just have been making materials out of them here. So if you look, I have my mesh, and then the maps that it makes for all these things. And so they're all already in here all set up, but I did pull up just a few of the materials here. So basically I'm just plugging in kind of just a value here just to make it look kind of like concrete maybe. And then it's just taking in these other maps here. Oh, and actually it is taking in the concrete from the starter content stuff. So that's pretty good. But then I'm just plugging in my base normal. I'm actually doing a normal blend. That way I can get my normal as well as the concrete normal. So I get a little bit better look out of the concrete. And then my AO, and I'm just plugging everything in, giving it a roughness of 1. Same thing here. Just kind of doing that same thing. Plugging in my maps, multiplying it with the concrete. Give me something like that. Pillar, same thing. Here's the sandblasted one. Can't really see too much of the blasting in here. But once we get in the scene here, you can kind of see some of those holes, some of the blasting. Again, I exaggerated it quite a bit on my example, but for this one I really wanted to just dial it back, so it was just kind of some like peeling and some little holes like that. But yeah, you can see all the pieces I made. So there's kind of the door topper there. There's some rocks from the rock generator that we did just using the interior noise. Here's a column that I just broke in several pieces using the hero asset breaker, kind of like we did on the door topper there. This was also using the interior noise thing to kind of get some pieces of the topper there, and some more rocks. And there you go. So once these combine with the undamaged pieces, if I wanted to really like make a whole scene out of this thing, this is a really nice starting like kit bash set for a weathered and damaged interior of a building or something. So yeah, there you go.